One of Jean-Paul Sartre's most radical claims is also one of his easiest to misunderstand. The self is not a thing. It is not an inner object, not a fixed core, not a stable identity waiting to be discovered. The self, Sartre argues, is a project, something that is continually being made rather than something that already exists. This claim follows directly from everything we have already seen in Sartre's philosophy. If consciousness is not a substance, if it is defined by nothingness, negation, and projection, then the self cannot be a substance either. There is no inner me sitting behind experience, directing action from a stable position. There is only the movement of consciousness toward what it is not yet. Sartre insists that most people resist this idea instinctively. They want the self to be something solid, something they can point to and say, "This is who I am." That desire for solidity is understandable. A fixed self promises relief from responsibility. If I already am something, then my actions merely express that fact rather than create it. Sartre's philosophy exists to dismantle this comfort. For Sartre, the self is not given at birth, not revealed through introspection, and not secured through consistency. It emerges over time through action. What you do, how you choose, what you commit to, and how you interpret those commitments, these form the self. And because action never stops, the self is never finished. This is what Sartre means by calling the self a project. A project is not a plan in the everyday sense. It is not a conscious blueprint one draws up in advance. It is the overall orientation of a life, the way one relates to the world, values certain possibilities over others, and pursues certain ends rather than alternatives. Much of this happens implicitly, without reflection. You do not first possess a self and then act. You act, and through those actions, a self takes shape. This reverses the ordinary way people think about identity. Most people assume that character explains behavior. Sartre insists that behavior explains character. What you are is not the cause of what you do. What you do is the source of what you are. This does not mean that the past is irrelevant. Past actions matter enormously. They shape habits, expectations, and possibilities, but they do not determine the future. The past is part of the situation in which one acts, not a verdict that closes the case. Sartre is careful here. He does not claim that one can reinvent oneself effortlessly. He does not deny inertia, habit, or constraint. What he denies is finality. No description of the self ever captures necessity. To say, "This is who I am," is to pretend that becoming has ended. This is why Sartre treats identity claims with suspicion. Statements like, "I'm just not that kind of person," or "that's not who I am," function as closures. They convert past patterns into destiny. Sartre hears in them a refusal of freedom. The idea of the self as a project also explains why Sartre rejects the search for authenticity as self-discovery. There is no true self hidden behind appearances, waiting to be uncovered. Authenticity for Sartre does not mean finding oneself. It means acknowledging that there is nothing to find, only something to make. This is deeply unsettling. It means that introspection cannot reveal who you truly are. Reflection can only reveal what you have done and what you are in the process of doing. The future remains open, not because it is hopeful, but because it is undecided. Sartre's account also dissolves the idea of identity as possession. You do not have a self the way you have an object. The self exists only insofar as it is lived. When action stops, the project stops. There is no self behind the act that remains untouched. This is why Sartre insists that even reflection is an action. When you think about who you are already shaping the project. Interpretation is not neutral. To describe yourself in a certain way is already to take up a stance toward your past and future. The self as a project therefore exists in time. It is stretched between what has been and what is not yet. Sartre calls this temporal structure fundamental. Human beings are always oriented toward the future, toward possibilities that do not yet exist. This orientation is not optional. Even refusal to plan is itself a project. Even resignation is a way of relating to the future. Sartre insists that one cannot escape projection. Consciousness is always ahead of itself. This explains why the self feels unstable. There is no moment when one coincides perfectly with oneself. One is always more than what one has been and less than what one hopes to be. This gap is not a flaw. It is the structure of existence. Sartre believes this instability is what drives people to seek fixed identities. Labels, roles, and character traits offer a way to freeze the project and say, "Here I am." But freezing the project is an illusion. One continues to act, and through action the project continues, whether acknowledged or not. At this stage, Sartre's analysis is still descriptive. He has not yet accused the reader of bad faith. He is simply showing why the temptation to fix the self is so strong. The self as a project is demanding. It offers no resting place. This also explains why people often feel anxious when asked who they really are. The question assumes a completed answer. Sartre denies that such an answer exists. One can describe patterns, commitments, and tendencies, but never an essence. The self, in Sartre's sense, is always at stake. It is what is being made through action right now. By the end of this first part, the core claim should be clear. The self is not something hidden inside you. It is not something you can finally discover. It is the ongoing result of how you choose to live in a world that does not decide for you. But this is only half of the story, because if the self is a project, then it can be misunderstood, frozen, and lied about. The desire to turn the self into a thing does not disappear once it is recognized. It intensifies. That is where Sartre's analysis must go next. If the self is a project rather than a thing, then identity is never simply what one is. It is what one is doing with oneself. Sartre insists that this fact is almost never lived honestly. Human beings do not merely live their projects. They attempt to stabilize them, freeze them, and convert them into identities that feel necessary rather than chosen. This attempt does not arise from confusion, it arises from fatigue. A project that never settles is demanding. It offers no moment of rest where one can say, "Now this is finished." Responsibility renews itself with every action. Sartre believes this constant openness is what drives people to treat the self as if it were a completed object. Identity in this sense becomes a defense. When someone says, "This is who I am," they are not merely describing patterns of behavior. They are drawing a boundary around their future. They are converting what has been into what must be. Sartre hears in this move an attempt to escape the weight of becoming. This is why Sartre treats character traits with suspicion. To describe oneself as courageous, timid, loyal, selfish, or principled is not false in a descriptive sense. These words capture regularities. But when they are used to explain or excuse action, they become closures. They suggest necessity where there is none. Sartre insists that no character trait ever compels action. One becomes courageous by acting courageously. One remains so only insofar as one continues to act that way. The moment one refuses, the description loses its force. Identity has no power of enforcement. This fragility explains why people cling to roles. Roles offer external confirmation. If one can say, "I am a teacher, I am a parent, I am a professional," then one's actions appear to flow from something fixed. The role seems to act in one's place, but roles do not act, people do. To treat a role as destiny is to deny the project that sustains it. Sartre does not deny that roles structure life. He denies that they remove freedom. One chooses how to occupy a role, what it will justify, and when it will be resisted. This is where the self as a project intersects with bad faith, even if Sartre has not yet named it explicitly. The self becomes misunderstood when it is treated as a thing rather than an activity. One lies to oneself about what one is in order to avoid what one must still become. Sartre is particularly attentive to how the past is used in this process. People often treat their past actions as verdicts. I have always been like this, they say, as if repetition creates necessity. Sartre insists that repetition creates expectation, not obligation. The past is part of one's situation, not one's essence. It informs but does not decide. To treat the past as destiny is to give it a power it does not possess. This is why Sartre rejects narratives of identity that treat life as a story with a fixed character arc. Stories imply coherence, direction, and inevitability. Human lives are not like that. They are sequences of commitments that can always be interrupted. The self as a project, therefore, cannot be summarized honestly. Any summary freezes movement. Any label obscures openness. Sartre believes this is why people feel uneasy when asked to define themselves. The demand itself is dishonest. At the same time, Sartre recognizes that people cannot live without some sense of identity. One must orient oneself in the world. One must make sense of one's past and future. The problem is not identity itself, but mistaking identity for essence. Identity becomes dangerous when it claims authority over future action. When one says, "I can't do that because that's not who I am," one has already decided not to decide. This refusal is rarely dramatic. It appears in small, everyday ways. People avoid risks, resist change, or excuse inaction by appealing to who they are. Sartre sees these appeals as evasions rather than descriptions. The self as a project also explains why authenticity is fragile. Authenticity for Sartre is not a state one achieves. It is a way of relating to one's own becoming. It requires constant recognition that what one is cannot be separated from what one does. This recognition is uncomfortable because it removes the comfort of self-concept. One cannot hide behind personality, temperament, or role. One must answer for how one takes them up. Sartre does not believe this leads to chaos or arbitrariness. Projects develop coherence over time, commitments accumulate, lives take on shape. What he denies is that this shape ever becomes necessary. Even long-standing commitments remain choices that must be reaffirmed. To continue is to choose to continue. To stop is also to choose. This understanding reshapes responsibility. Responsibility does not attach to a static self. It attaches to action. One is responsible not for who one is, but for what one makes of what one has been. This is why Sartre rejects both pride and self-condemnation when they rely on fixed identity. Pride assumes completion, condemnation assumes finality. Both misunderstand the project. By the end of this analysis, the self appears not as a possession, but as a task. One is always engaged in making oneself, whether one acknowledges it or not. The refusal to acknowledge it does not stop the project, it merely distorts it. This distortion becomes more serious when the self is not only frozen internally, but imposed externally. Others define us. Institutions classify us. Social identities harden. The project collides with the look. That collision is unavoidable. And when the self as a project meets the expectations, judgments, and pressures of others, the tension intensifies. Identity becomes not only a personal defense, but a social one. That is where Sartre's analysis must turn next.